any other?
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks, and in this bulletin we'll get you a roundup of stories developing all over the world. First up, the day's top headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin holds a virtual summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping, promising to meet in person in February of next year. Both leaders discuss US activity in the Asia-Pacific and accuse the Aukus alliance of breeding tensions in the region. The European Union says it's ready to scale up sanctions and take unprecedented measures against Russia if the Kremlin engages in further aggression. Annual inflation in Britain skyrocketed in November to 5.1%, the highest level in more than 10 years. But to 5.1%, the highest level in more than 10 years. The United Arab Emirates suspends discussions to acquire US-made F-35 fighter jets, citing technical requirements and sovereign operational restrictions.
It was a request to come in and protect the population so that the country, the city doesn't fall into chaos.
A shocking claim today from former Afghan President Hamid Karzai. He says that the Taliban did not seize the Afghan capital unilaterally, but says they were invited in by him after the secret and sudden departure of former Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. And South Africa's High Court declares medical parole for Jacob Zuma unlawful, ordering the former South African president back to jail to continue serving his 15-month prison sentence for contempt. We're going to begin today with some news that is breaking here in Washington right now. The State Department within the last few minutes has confirmed that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is ending his tour of Southeast Asia early after a member of his travelling entourage tested positive for COVID-19. He will not now travel to Thailand. He spent today in Malaysia, having earlier in the week been in Indonesia, making a big speech in Jakarta, where he outlined the future of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific policy. A statement that has just been issued by the spokesman at the US Department of State says that the Secretary of State has spoken with the Thai Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister and expressed his deep regret that he will not be able to visit Bangkok this week. He explained that in order to mitigate the risk of the spread of COVID-19 and to prioritise the health and safety of the US travelling party and those they would meet in Bangkok, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, it was reported that possibly one of the journalists travelling with the Secretary of State has tested positive and is now in isolation, but clearly enough to warrant the scrubbing of the rest of what was scheduled to be the longest trip out of the United States that Antony Blinken has taken since he became Secretary of State at the beginning of the Biden administration earlier this year. We will, by the way, be getting a briefing today here from Dr. Anthony Fauci and other members of President Biden's COVID-19 response team, and it's going to be very interesting to see what they have to say about the Omicron variant, given that up until now the White House has evinced not a great deal of concern about the extent to which Omicron is taking root in the United States. So the breaking news: Antony Blinken terminating his visit to Southeast Asia early because someone in his travelling party has tested positive for COVID-19. Stay with WION. We'll bring you more on that throughout the night. Now, to what was going to be our top story of this bulletin. The United Arab Emirates has suspended talks with the US over a $23 billion deal to buy weapons, including F-35 fighter jets. The deal hit a roadblock after the Biden administration attached what the UAE calls stringent conditions to the purchase. An Emirati official said they are reassessing the billion-dollar deal due to technical requirements and sovereign operational restrictions placed by the United States. The sale of the F-35 was inked last year by the Trump administration after the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, normalizing its relations with Israel. But the deal has come under mounting scrutiny since President Biden took office. Washington has concerns about China's involvement with the UAE, and it's reported the White House is insisting on conditions to ensure the F-35s would be protected from Chinese espionage and surveillance. The Biden administration worries that the UAE's use of Huawei's 5G technology raises the risk that sensitive information could be leaked to Beijing. The US wants to reduce any exposure to Chinese technology. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said the US is prepared to move forward with the sale of the jets and drones if Dubai wants to continue pursuing the deal with those conditions attached. The decision to suspend talks comes just a week after the UAE sealed a $19 billion deal with France to purchase 80 Rafale jets and 12 Caracal helicopters manufactured by French groups Dassault Aviation and Airbus. The UAE's Crown Prince has struck a deepening relationship with French President Emmanuel Macron, especially on security and defence matters. The F-35s are prized for their stealth capabilities and the capacity to gather intelligence, as well as the ability to strike deep into enemy territory and engage in air duels. Amid tensions over Iran's nuclear program, the US has informed Israeli defense officials that it will not be able to supply them with new refueling tankers until late 2024. It's reported that Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who was here in Washington only last week, wanted his US counterpart Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to deliver the Boeing KC-46 refueling planes as rapidly as possible. But the United States says the jets cannot be delivered for the next few years. The tankers are a multi-mission aircraft. They're capable of transporting fuel, cargo and passengers, and they can refuel Allied and military aircraft that are compatible with international aerial refueling procedures. The aircraft can also detect, avoid, defeat and survive threats using multiple layers of force protection. Israel ordered the new tankers back in March, hoping to add them to its existing fleet amid growing tensions with Iran. Israel's current fleet is more than 50 years old. It's based on the Boeing 707. The new fleet of tankers would give Israel far more range and ability. There are other tensions evident between the US and Israel. In discussions with Israeli diplomats, the Biden administration said that it puts the issue of settlements in the Palestinian territories on the same level as the Iranian nuclear threat. Those comments did not sit well with Israeli officials. WION's correspondent Jody Cohen spoke to Helit Burrell, an expert on US-Israel relations and the former head of the Council for Peace and Security. Here's what he had to say on the growing tensions between Israel and the Biden administration.
Halit, the US has reportedly told Israel that new refueling planes won't be ready until 2024. Now, these are crucial to a potential strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. What is the US's thinking behind this?
Well, I think, first of all, there's an actual, just realistically, a problem with production and means, and there's competition in the United States. There are requirements by the Air Force as well for these tankers. And at this time, it doesn't seem like the United States wants Israel to take any action on its own, regardless. But it's important to remember that while these tankers would definitely enhance Israeli capacity, doesn't mean Israel doesn't have capacity or tankers and has not already been planning such operations, even without the new equipment.
So I was going to ask you about that. Actually, does Israel have the capacity to target Iran's nuclear sites with its current capabilities? And are Israel and the US on the same page when it comes to taking military action to prevent Iran from achieving a nuclear bomb? And how do their approaches differ?
Well, first, there is certainly a debate, an open debate in Israel about whether or not a strike is operationally feasible. That Israel has operational capabilities, I think, is obvious. The question, of course, is to what extent. So is this, I think everybody is on the same page that this is not a similar scenario to an attack in Iraq in the 1980s, where you take out the nuclear program completely. So the question is, what do you achieve, and is it worth what the consequences might be, which might be a regional war using Iran's proxies of Hezbollah in Gaza against Israel, so on and so forth. So it's an open debate. That operational capacity exists, absolutely it does. The question is to what extent and how much would that strike be worth. With regards to the United States and Israel, I think it's clear that at this time, they are not, there is no full coordination on the issue of a strike, but it's important to remember that as the JCPOA, the talks in Vienna are progressing or not so much progressing, the United States, along with other allies, are looking at alternative options. This is not an Israeli issue. That Israel is more advanced in its thinking on that, and that Israel thinks that this needs to be a far more immediate and realistic option, I think is clear. But this is not to say that the United States and European allies, Britain in particular, are far from those lines of thinking, depending on how these talks progress. So far, it has not been promising.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down for virtual talks today that lasted for nearly 90 minutes. The Russian president said he expects to hold a face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping during the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics in early February. The Russian president said bilateral ties between Moscow and Beijing are a real example of how relations between states can develop in the 21st century. Amid a growing call by the West and its allies to boycott the Beijing Olympics, Vladimir Putin said that he stands firmly against the politicization of the Games, and he rejected the idea out of hand.
Уважаемый друг, уважаемый председатель Си Цзиньпинь, рассчитываю, что в феврале следующего года...
Dear friend, dear President Xi Jinping, next February I expect we can finally meet in person in Beijing as we have agreed. We will hold talks and then participate in the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympic Games. I'm grateful for your invitation to attend this landmark event. This year in our relations has been marked by the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. It is being prolonged for another 5 years. The consistent implementation of this fundamental document, which reflects deep historical traditions of friendship and mutual understanding between the Russian and Chinese people, allowed to take our relations to the next breakthrough level.
According to a Kremlin statement, both presidents agreed that the Aukus alliance is breeding tensions and undermining non-proliferation efforts. The two sides also discussed in detail US activity in the Asia-Pacific region. The Russia-Ukraine standoff was another talking point. Moscow's knock at China's door comes at a time when the US is working with its NATO allies to develop what it calls alternatives over the crisis. Over the weekend, G7 foreign ministers issued a statement condemning Russia's troop build-up at the Ukrainian border. As Putin met Xi Jinping today, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was warning of unprecedented measures against Russia if there is any escalation of the border crisis. She said the ball is now entirely in Moscow's court.
We can encourage and potentially think about mandatory vaccination. A whole set of economic sanctions in place, targeting the financial and energy sector, dual-use goods and defence. Our response to any further aggression may take the form of a robust scaling up and expansion of these existing sanctions. And of course, we are ready to take additional, unprecedented measures with serious consequences for Russia. But above all, I call on Russia to de-escalate, to pursue diplomatic channels, and to abide by its international commitments. Conflicts must be solved peacefully.
The two leaders also spoke about how trade ties between both countries have expanded. Russia-China trade turnover increased by a third in the first 11 months of this year, exceeding pre-pandemic levels. WION's correspondent Julia Chapman sent us this report from Moscow.
Russia hasn't acknowledged the numbers that Kiev has accused it of building up on the borders. It's only referred to a few military drills that it has been carrying out in southern Russia, but nothing like the numbers that we've been hearing from Western countries and from Ukraine, with the US saying there could be as many as 175,000 Russian troops in place on the Ukrainian border by January. Kiev says there's already about 95,000 Russian troops in the area. And all of this has, of course, been leading to growing concern among European countries and other NATO partners over the past month, with Russia, of course, denying that it has any ill intent towards Ukraine, but it has also been accusing Ukraine of stoking tensions and of carrying out a build-up of its own along the conflict line in the Donbass, that region of eastern Ukraine where Russian-backed rebels are fighting the Ukrainian military. Of course, that's been going on since 2014 and has led to around 13,000 deaths in that time, according to Kiev. But the tensions have been rising in recent weeks, and that has been causing great concern on both sides of the border. Of course, here in Russia, there are concerns that NATO is building up closer to its borders. It's been warning about expanding NATO to include Ukraine, something that Moscow would find very unsettling, and has been seeking guarantees from the bloc to say that it will not expand to include Ukraine, something that NATO is simply not prepared to guarantee.
Now, some astonishing claims from Hamid Karzai, who of course served as Afghanistan's president for 13 years. In an interview with the Associated Press, he has revealed details about the secret and sudden departure of the ousted Afghan president Ashraf Ghani. Karzai says when Ghani and all his top officials, including Defence Minister Bismillah Khan and the Kabul police chief, fled the country, he, Karzai, then invited the Taliban into the city to protect its people and to prevent the country from falling into chaos. Karzai said Ashraf Ghani did not flee the country in a hurry and that his departure was a negotiated deal, that he, Hamid Karzai, negotiated an agreement with the Taliban leadership in Doha that saw their forces enter the capital.
It was a request to come in and protect the population so that the country, the city doesn't fall into chaos and the unwanted elements who would probably loot the country, loot shops. So it was an automatic process subsequent to that and an inevitability. The government should stay in its positions and should not move, that they have no intention to enter the city. And I and others spoke to various officials, and assurances were given to us that yes, that was the case, that the Americans and the government forces were holding firm to the places and that Kabul would not fall. There was no official presence at all in the capital. No police chief, no corps commander, no other units. They had all left.
According to Hamid Karzai, the Taliban leadership in Qatar promised that they would remain outside the city until the deal was struck. Even on August the 15th, the day of Kabul's fall, Karzai says he called Taliban leaders in Doha and was told their fighters would not enter the city. He reiterated that there would have been an agreement for a peaceful transition had Ashraf Ghani remained in Kabul.
Absolutely. That is what we were preparing for. We were hoping, together with the chairman of the Peace Council, Dr. Abdullah and other elders of the country, to go to Doha that evening or the next morning and to finalize an agreement. And I believe the Taliban leaders were also waiting for us in Doha for the same objective, for the same purpose.
Currently, in his talks with the Taliban, Karzai is advocating the temporary resurrection of the constitution that governed the country when it was a monarchy. That idea was also floated during earlier talks in Doha. He says a traditional lawyer jirga, a grand council of all Afghans, including women, will be convened to decide the country's future. However, there is no indication that the Taliban will accept his formula. Though Karzai says the Taliban have not rejected the plan yet in discussions, the former Afghan president said that in future the country must have universal education rights for boys and for girls, and that women must find their place in the country's political, economic and social sectors. He says until that happens, the international community needs to continue engaging with the Taliban and putting pressure on them.
The Taliban government and us, the Afghan people, must do all that is necessary within the country by way of seeking the will of the Afghan people, bringing all the Afghan people together, having a truly representative government of the Afghan people, broadly representative, so that all the Afghan people see themselves represented in that mirror of the country. And that the women return to work and girls go to school. So all that is necessary and good for Afghanistan we must do. And when we do that, the international community will have no reason to deny us recognition. They will definitely come and recognize.
Now let's look beyond our own horizons. NASA's James Webb Space Telescope, which is slated to be launched next week, is all set to usher in a new era of space exploration. Designed to be about 100 times more sensitive than its predecessor, the Hubble telescope, it's expected to collect more data about the formation of stars and planets beyond our solar system.
Finding an Earth-like planet would be amazing. I mean, we only know of one planet for sure where life exists, and that's Earth. But, you know, that's again the whole reason we launch telescopes like Webb, is that we know that planets of all sizes are out there, and we want to find ones that have similar temperatures and sizes as Earth to see if they could possibly be anything like Earth.
It is, of course, the season of lush Christmas trees adorned with baubles and twinkly lights. But every year after Christmas celebrations, dead trees are left abandoned. I can tell you, they litter the streets here in Washington, D.C. About 7 million trees end up in landfills every year. But now a start-up in London has come up with a solution for that.
London is abuzz with festive cheer. Extravagant decorations, baubles and twinkling porches decorated with lights. And the crisp festive air as business picks up. There is also a slight shift in consumption patterns as residents look for more eco-friendly alternatives for Yuletide this year. What do you think about reusable Christmas trees? Not plastic trees that you can assemble each year. Actual Christmas trees that can be rented and then taken back post-Christmas for replanting. You heard that right. This company in London, in an effort to keep trees out of landfills, is introducing this eco-friendly option.
A customer will choose what size they want and they'll order as early as beginning of November, and then they can come to a hub and they can choose their tree, and the trees are living, so they're in a pot. So they're quite heavy, but they basically can choose their tree, they take it home, it comes into the house for the Christmas period, and then after Christmas it can go, they return it back here, it goes back to the farm where it's put into a special irrigation system, and then it's cared for until the following year. And then if they liked their tree, then they can rent it and have it back the following year.
They started this experiment with just about 50 trees, and it turned out to be quite a hit as people loved the idea of renting a tree and then sending them back. Each year, about 7 million dead trees end up in the landfills post-Christmas. These trees are repotted in giant pots and are nursed with special irrigation systems on this farm.
So something new we're using this year is this compostable net here. Now this is 100% plant-based netting, so this will break down, it won't break down to microplastics, it will break back down to vegetation, so it can go through commercial composting plants and be used and completely disappear. So no microplastics from that, whereas a traditional net that we would have used would have probably broken down to microplastics.
This year, there is a renewed interest in environmental friendly options. And these giant potted trees could be a good place to start. Bureau Report WION, World is One.
Absolutely fantastic idea. That is all we have on today's WION Live broadcast from Washington. I'm Simon Marks. I'll be back again soon for more global news and updates. Stay tuned to WION, World is One.
Many other
this is right, Arab.